I call the meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the June 1st, 2026 study session of your Ashland City Council. This evening we have two agenda items: the update regarding the state mandated land use ordinance amendments, Senate Bill 974 and House Bill 2138, and then the Community Wildfire Resilience Bond. Sabrina?
Thank you. So tonight, our first one, we're going to go through an informational update regarding upcoming state mandated amendments to Chapter 18 of our land use ordinance. So I'm going to have Director Goldman go through those changes that are dictated by Senate Bill 974 and House Bill 2138.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Brandon.
It's not on, Brandon. There you go. Thank you.
Good. Brandon Goldman, Community Development Department.
Derek Severson, Planning Supervisor.
So thank you for hearing us this evening. We wanted to give you an overview of recent legislative changes at the state that are going to be impacting all communities throughout the state of Oregon. Essentially, the purpose of tonight's discussion is intended as an informational meeting in order to update the council specifically about Senate Bill 974 and the city's ongoing efforts to implement that legislation. So no action is requested of council this evening, but other than comments and questions that you may have. So the purpose of the presentation is to provide an overview, explain the legislation adopted by the bill, discuss how it changes land use process within Ashland and the decision-making process, and also outline the next steps in this legislative amendment process. And I also wanted to provide an update in terms of the Planning Commission's review of this. They have previously reviewed Senate Bill 974 as part of a review of all legislation that impacts land use, but most recently on May 26th, the Planning Commission looked at Section 974 specifically and have made some recommendations. So in terms of the overview, the 2025 Oregon Legislature adopted several significant housing-related bills, as you're well aware. They're all intended to increase housing production and reduce barriers to residential development. Senate Bill 974 is among the most consequential of those because it directly affects local land use review proceedings. And I'll go into what those changes are specifically. But unlike many housing bills that focus on development standards, density, housing type, or financing, Senate Bill 974 primarily focuses on the process. And the legislature's objectives were to reduce delays associated with processing land use applications by ensuring that those which they consider urban housing applications are dealt with administratively as opposed to through a public hearing process. And it limits the number of hearings that a project may be potentially presented before. So the bill really shifts certain housing applications away from the traditional quasi-judicial legislative process and forwards them to administrative review. And what that means in a nutshell is that an applicant doing a subdivision, for instance, instead of going to the Planning Commission for review and decision, would be presenting to city staff, applying the same standards that are in place now, but approving or denying it at an administrative level. So the current process, an application is submitted to the city, staff reviews that application, identifies the components that are met or are not met, and provides that staff review to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission has that hearing, and it makes a decision for the city. If an applicant or a neighbor or an affected party wants to appeal that decision, they appeal that decision to the city council. And the city council is then the final decision maker of the city. Following a council appeal, an applicant or a neighbor can appeal that to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Senate 974 changes that process substantially. Essentially, the first decision is made by staff, then that goes to the Planning Commission on appeal, and if the Planning Commission's decision, which then becomes the final decision of the city, if that's appealed, it goes directly to the Land Use Board of Appeals. And as such, the city council currently serves as an appellant body, but would not do so after 974, specifically for urban housing applications. And we have to make that distinction because there is a category within 974 that says what qualifies for that expedited review process and what doesn't.
Did you want to take questions as we go?
Yeah.
Councillor Hanson.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much, Brandon. As I read this, I was curious. The first step makes absolute sense in the new process, but then taking city council out of the mix there and going straight to LUBA, I don't know how long a LUBA appeal is, so could you help me in understanding, maybe you can help shed some light on what the state was thinking in taking out the council appeal? It seems like that would be a more expedited process. And then relative to with these residential applications, how long would a LUBA appeal take for just perspective?
Yeah, I think that if a application was to conclude at the end of a council appeal, that would likely be a more expedited process.
Correct.
However, many applications have a council decision and then are appealed to LUBA.
Right.
So the city is obligated under existing and future rules to process a decision locally within 120 days. So that's our shot clock. So this doesn't.
And does that change at all from the old to the new?
It changes to 100 days for affordable housing applications, but those are a very limited subset of applications.
Right, okay.
So the shot clock stays 120 days. And we would review that application through the staff decision with time for a planning commission appeal. Currently, we try and expedite that so that an appeal before council can also be completed within that 120-day period. So the final decision of the planning commission usually is after 60 days. And so if an applicant can appeal to LUBA at that point, it could theoretically save them 2 months of local process by jumping to the state appeal board. And a LUBA appeal, I'm not sure exactly on the timing. We've had one recently, and I'd say that added probably about 60 days to their review process.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. And thanks, Brandon. Yeah, Councillor Hanson asked a lot of what I was asking, what I want to know relative to the timing. And so it still is something that, yeah, I still kind of am a little concerned about pulling the city council out of that process, even though I understand the timing of it. Is there potential, first question, is Senate Bill 974 unequivocal on that is the process? There is no local ability to provide an option to appeal to the city council before LUBA?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that the intention is to have an administrative decision by staff with one appeal at the local level.
So then my second question would be going back upstream to the staff decision process. What have you guys found in your opinion has been the things that cause the most delay or otherwise getting these types of administrative approvals you're seeing them denied? What mostly happens when they're denied?
Sure. I'd like Derek
At the
to
administrative
answer
level,
as
I'm
well.
sorry. Yeah.
From my experience, the current planning application denied at either an administrative level or at a planning commission level is often because an application itself is either incomplete or requesting a variance or a modification that is not commensurate with the intention of the code. So in terms of approval process, those can also be slowed down if we receive an application from an applicant that is at 80%, but it's missing key information, at which point we'll have to reach back out to the applicant, ask them to submit addendums to that application. So it's really, the delays typically happen before we deem it a complete application. Once we deem it complete, we send out the notice, schedule the hearings, and it moves along that timeline in a rather expeditious manner. But there can be a lot of back and forth before an application is considered complete.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you find that in that back and forth that there's too much subjectivity, or do you feel that it's right on as far as the applicant is actually just specifically missing basic pieces of information? deem it incomplete.
Might be for Derek as the planning manager to.
It's typically that the applicant is missing specific pieces. Our code calls out for each component of the application what has to be submitted to meet requirements. And if we're writing an incomplete letter, we're referencing specifically the code says you need to provide this in AMC, whatever, and you haven't done it. So it's rarely subjective. The other thing I would note in terms of denials is denials are exceedingly rare. I think in 25 years as a planner, I think we've denied 3 applications. It probably is more common to have a reversal from LUBA than a denial from staff or the Planning Commission. And that's because we have, to begin with, a pre-application process and then a completeness review process where we're really working with the applicants to get a complete approvable application before a notice ever goes out.
And I have a number of other questions from counselors. Just a reminder that we do need to move through this, and these are required changes from the state government, so just keep that in mind. Councilor Kaplan?
Thank you, Mayor. My question, I guess, it has to do with the relative cost. It sounds like the staff, and what I'm hearing from you is that the staff review involves some back and forth and about completion and all of this sort of thing. So this, changing that to a staff decision sounds like it wouldn't add additional costs for staff because you're already doing a fair bit of review and then prepping of the Planning Commission, the packet, all doing all that sort of thing. So there might actually be a savings because you wouldn't have to go before the Planning Commission on most of these things unless there's a final an appeal. Is that right?
I agree. And in the event that an application is submitted and it's reviewed administratively, we'd still send out a notice to all the impacted neighbors, get feedback from them, and then make a staff decision. If it's not appealed, that is consistent with what we do currently, where we send out notice to the neighbors advising them of the Planning Commission meeting. Where it does add potential workload for community development staff is in the event that if staff decisions are regularly appealed to the Planning Commission in order to exercise that public engagement, at which point we will be doing those notices multiple times or twice.
Right.
Councilor Bloom?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I understand because, some councils are going to be kind of anti-development, anti-growth, and we want to, obviously in Oregon, we want to encourage that. This council's been the opposite. I mean, we've reversed planning commission decisions because we wanted to be more pro-growth. So I'm looking at the definitions under 974, and it says comprehensive plan amendments and zone changes to increase density are included in those definitions, which are obviously a high-level decision, and we're talking about an unelected body that is going to be the final decision maker. So the question is the only workaround here is to essentially properly vet and make sure that we're appointing members of the Planning Commission that are going to be aligned with our more pro-growth vision?
So you highlighted a very important point and a distinction that was discussed at length at the Planning Commission. A number of the changes, subdivisions, variances handled at administrative level are likely things that would typically go before the Planning Commission, but not rise to the level of council. Zone changes, comprehensive plan changes, those have always required an ordinance, and they require an ordinance under state law, and an ordinance by definition has to have a public hearing. So we see a conflict between existing ORS 227 and Senate Bill 974, where one says you have to have a hearing, another says that you can't have a hearing. So in terms of process, our guidance is to look to Department of Land Conservation and Development and ask them to opine on how we process that. In doing so, their response essentially was that they are going to be doing rulemaking beginning in January of 2027 to address the implementation steps for 974, but that does not exempt the city from the responsibility to adopt code amendments prior to that date. So we're anticipating from the Planning Commission, the commission did not recommend amendments to the city's existing zone change procedures at this time, again, noting that that's a public hearing requirement. And given the lack of guidance from the state regarding the application or implementation of 974, the commission recommend maintaining that procedure until additional direction is provided. We don't see a lot of zone change for increased residential density. In the event we do, I'm sure legal counsel will be involved in terms of how to process that. But at this point in time, our recommendation, and consistent with the Planning Commission's, will be to draft amendments to 974, incorporating all of the legislative requisite changes with the exception of the zone change and comp plan change, which would then still have to come to council for review and approval.
Councilor Sherrill.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you both. This is super exciting, and I realize it's only informational only, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but can you talk, either of you, briefly about what we expect this will change, what we expect this will streamline, and how it affects what we see as one of the largest barriers to housing production in the country, which is the not in my backyard attitude, and how the appellant could potentially take responsibility for some of that burden? And can you share how you think it will affect production in our city?
Sure. Some immediate changes that I would foresee is, given the recommendations, we're looking at some discretionary changes concurrent with the state mandated. One is how we process subdivisions. Currently, and I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds, subdivisions of 10 units or more are considered type 2 actions that have an outline plan, a final plan. It's a two-step process. An applicant has to submit a full application, get approval, and then do all the engineering, submit that, and get that approved. So we are looking at changing that 10 units to 20 units. And as an administrative approval, you could see housing developments of 20 units or less that come in with one plan to develop it, submit it to staff for an administrative review. We'll review all the requisite requirements, everything from street access, street widths, building setbacks, building heights, all of those, and approved at the staff level. And if not appealed to the Planning Commission, then the applicant could really accelerate that development and move forward. It will have some benefit to the applicant to process it as a type 1 planning action versus a type 2 planning action, not just in that timing accelerant, but also because the application fee for a type 1 is less than the application fee for a type 2. And reviewing all the applications that we've had over the prior year, there were only 3 that would qualify under that standard, and they'd save about $1,500 per applicant on that. So that is a cost savings for the application. The second part of your question, I'm forgetting now.
It had to do with the appellant bearing some of the burden if there's an appeal, and if they lose the appeal, they potentially have a responsibility to reimburse the city for time and potentially legal, which would hopefully in turn discourage people that are not quoting a direct, clear, and objective standard to resist housing, right, to have less incentive to try to just waste somebody's time and cost them money?
Sure. I think there's 2 different appeals. The appeal to the Planning Commission of a staff decision would have an appeal fee, but it doesn't have that responsible for attorney fees. That an appeal of a needed housing to LUBA that is found to be an unnecessary appeal that didn't cite, reasons for overturning or remanding, LUBA can award attorney fees, and those attorney fees could be if the city's attorney was a respondent or the applicant's attorney was a respondent. And that was legislation that was passed, I think, in 2024 to really stop abuse of legislative or of appeal process for, appeals of clear and objective standards that are met.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. Hopefully that will have a positive effect. And then the second question I have is, with all this downward pressure from the state to really, this is implemented when the governor signs it, I believe, based on emergency, and we're trying to catch up. State planning goals say we're going to do rulemaking for this next year. You have staff that's working on all the incoming applications. I understand that we maybe have a vacancy that we can't fill right now due to budgetary constraints. Like, how can this body help your office get the people it needs to write and implement these plans that the state has mandated on us that's already in effect that we don't even have code for yet?
Yeah, it's not in effect yet. it goes into effect July 1st. We're not going to be able to go through the Planning Commission and City Council hearing and adoption process for the ordinance adoption by then, but an applicant could apply under state law, and we would process it on July 2nd in that same, or July 1st according to the state rules. But to answer your question, Derek has already gone through a code audit and identified all the sections of our code that need to be amended, and we have that draft language. I took that to the Planning Commission on May 26th. They reviewed it and had made a number of recommendations that we can incorporate in terms of, definitions and looking at being consistent with state law in a few areas. So our expectation is to bring that back to the Planning Commission in July of this year for a public hearing, and to Council, I think on August 18th. I put on the look ahead to bring this forward at that point in time. I do fully anticipate, I just want everybody to be aware, that after the Department of Land Conservation and Development has completed their rulemaking, we may need to go back into our ordinance and revise it further. But that should be a matter of house cleaning rather than this big change having already been implemented. Thank you.
Great, so let's go ahead and move, we'll go through the whole presentation and hold our questions till the end. Go ahead.
Sure. So this map here, or this flow chart, you've seen it in your packet. It really shows what it applies. I know the text is too small to read on the screen for anybody at home. But I also wanted to note a special thanks to City of Medford and their long-range planning staff, who was going through the same process and created this flow chart. So we adapted it with their blessing to City of Ashland so that it showed the code changes, which I think reflects that all cities are doing this independently at this point. So I did want to talk about implementation challenges. As I stated before, the primary one is that the state's legislative rulemaking process has not yet begun. Ideally, that would have been completed before cities would be in a position to draft code. But the state has, in the meantime, we aren't prevented from utilizing the state's codes. Unfortunately, my notes are not viewable. But nonetheless, I think our approach was to adopt all the code amendments that are required for compliance, to retain the existing procedures where that uncertainty, and that gets back to what we talked about in the questions that Councilor Bloom brought up in terms of zone change and comprehensive plan change. And we will obviously continue to monitor DLCD's rulemaking. And I just wanted to, again, reassert that applicants can utilize the applicable state authorization provisions under Oregon law prior to completion of the code amendments. But our goal is to complete them, within a month or two of that July 1 start date. So given the number of applications that we received, there may be a couple that precede that, but we should have it in place by the time a new subdivision comes in. I'm not sure of any pre-applications even pending for such actions. So as I noted, the Planning Commission reviewed it on April 14th, and that was a broader discussion about other House bills and Senate bills. But they did make a number of recommendations when they reviewed it on May 26th, namely that the the subdivision threshold that I mentioned that's currently 10, we presented to them whether they would consider 20 as a viable change. And again, that's a discretionary change on behalf of the city. They were amenable to that. They also looked at revising the design standards within the the neighborhood mixed use area of North Mountain Plan. That is the only area within the city where we have residential design standards. One of the provisions of Senate Bill 974 is to not allow those design standards that could restrict housing design. But the state law includes a sunset on that because this is an effort to accelerate housing development, the state law says that limitation on design standards is to sunset on January 2nd of 2033. And so the Planning Commission suggested that we modify our code not as a permanent change to no longer require them, but to tie it to that sunset date of January 2nd, 2023, consistent with Senate Bill 974. In addition, we're looking at urban housing applications, and it is those applications that are outlined in your packet material to really look at the Senate Bill 974's definition. We had the term in our draft definition that presented to them that proposed facilities, and the state law actually says the word planned public facilities. And so the Planning Commission recommended that we modify the word proposed to be planned to be consistent with state law, recognizing that there's a difference between a public facility that is part of a plan that is planned by the city and a proposal of an applicant. And we already talked a little bit about the zone change procedures and rulemaking. So I did want to note that the Planning Commission, in our discussions, they were concerned that the process would reduce opportunities for local engagement and involvement by eliminating the Planning Commission review of planning actions that are qualifying housing applications, and that they would no longer be an initial decision-making body. As you know, under the proposed or the framework presented by 974, they would only review projects on appeal, and so that may limit the amount of work that they do on a regular basis. But they also do a lot of long-range planning work, so it may free up additional time for them to focus on those endeavors. So with that, essentially the next steps are Planning Commission hearing recommendation, council hearing, ordinance adoption process, monitor DLCD, and then have new codes in process and help applicants through that new process.
Questions? Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, a quick question about the design standard requirements and basically aligning ours with the sunset date with the state. Is there a way that we can just remove those design standard requirements sooner and just completely get rid of them?
There is. I think that the North Mountain neighborhood, that one particular neighborhood, the ordinance is embedded with a lot of illustrative designs as to what type of housing. In truth, I'd say probably 80% of that neighborhood is fully built out. But there is one large parcel adjacent to Bear Creek that still would have, under the North Mountain plan, would be subject to those. If they come in for a development before 2033, they would not apply. Or if the council or the Planning Commission remove that sunset date, we would modify that code to remove all those design standards. Those were applied by the city, so they could be removed by the city.
Is there any reason why we wouldn't?
It would be incongruent with the remainder of the development that was designed and built for the residents that bought into the normal neighborhood area anticipating.
So it would be an aesthetic concern?
It is an aesthetic, yeah.
Concern, okay, thank you.
Other questions? So one quick question is a follow-up to Councilor Bloom's question, and that is, so if we align the sunset dates, then this comes back into play. At that point, the council could look at what has happened in the intervening time and decide whether it wants to just keep going with what we had or revert back to those existing elements, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful. Any other questions? One last question. And that is, I know that we're in conversation with other planning departments as the state moves forward to implement these rules. Are there any discussions, maybe at the League of Oregon Cities, about how well it's working? I think it's always good if there's a feedback loop back to the state that says maybe this piece of it is working really well, maybe this one is giving us more trouble, or maybe there's a different way to expedite this housing and kind of in the overall goals that I believe we all share, which is to get housing built. Is there a particular place where that's happening?
I think through League of Oregon Cities is one mechanism. From a staff level, the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Housing Accountability Office have set up regular quarterly meetings to talk about the implementation of these statewide housing measures. And so having sat in on a number of those, there is a lot of feedback provided to DLCD from staff from various jurisdictions about what's working and not working or where confusion exists. So that is really a new initiative, I would say, over the last 2 years that DLCD has begun those more regular outreach efforts. So,
Well, yeah, I know there are concerns in conversations I have with other folks around the state that sometimes legislation gets put in place and it's a little bit of a one-size-fits-all, and it doesn't quite work for different sizes of communities the way it was intended. So this is a big change, and I think there's going to be a bit of experimentation that, you know, the state is on some level experimenting a bit with how we can move much more quickly without losing the original goals of our land use system.
so in addition to 974, I was prepared to talk a little bit about
Yes.
2138.
Yes.
So, and so essentially, the 2138 is a statewide authorization of single-room occupancy housing. So 2138 was adopted as part of the legislature's broader approach to address housing types across various communities and ensure that communities were not restricting specific housing types. So the bill requires cities to allow single-room occupancy housing in areas where multifamily housing is permitted, subject to reasonable siting and development standards. So Ashland has no code reference for single-room occupancies. However, we have approved a number of them over the years. Essentially, we've looked at multi-room, 4 bedrooms off of one shared kitchen, even if those bedrooms all have their own bathrooms, as being considered a multifamily single unit, and have approved a number of complexes that are effectively single-room occupancies. But this measure will drive the city of Ashland to actually incorporate that into our code. And really the intent is to provide housing for seniors on fixed income, young workers, single individuals, people with disability, people that may benefit from a small single-room occupancy that might be cost burdened by renting a full apartment. So to give you a visual of what a single room occupancy looks like, again, this is that 4-bedroom example of 4 rooms, each of which their own bathroom, but with a shared common area and kitchen. They could each be rented and leased independently from one another. So there are private rooms with their own private sleeping area. You know, the code, or the legislation indicates that an SRI has to either have shared bathrooms or a shared kitchen. So there is not a provision by which every unit could have its own kitchenette and bathroom. That would be essentially studio apartments. But again, I want to clarify that this is not affordable housing in a traditional deed restricted sense, but by merit of the housing type, it is lower cost and is one of the most low-cost housing types that can be developed. So again, 2138 expands that options to allow single-room occupants anywhere multifamily is allowed. So that would be in all of our R2 and R3 zones. And again, I think the clear and objective standards are necessitated. One of the provisions in the code was to not have burdensome parking requirements. Ashland eliminated all parking requirements, but I think some communities that might have wanted to restrict them would say that every housing unit has to have 2 parking spaces. So that 4-unit example that I showed has to have 8 parking spaces, which I would say is probably not reasonable. So I think the state was looking to ensure that those kinds of requirements were not chilling for the development of single-room occupancy. And again, this is another case where the next steps, in this case, we do have to do a code audit and look at the local code and make proposed amendments to the Planning Commission and ultimately this City Council to adopt. This one becomes operative in January of 2027 as the implementation date. And again, people can implement directly under state law. However, DLCD is not going to continue complete rulemaking for this until 2028. So it's a little bit of cart before the horse on both of these bills. So we'll adopt something and then subsequent to the rulemaking may need to come back to the table for revisions. So that's really all I had on that one, unless you have questions.
Counselor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, Brandon. On that one, I have a quick question relative to the term reasonable siting and design standards. Can you speak a little bit to what effect, if any, it would have on historic districts? Because I know recently there's been applications specifically in historic districts and even in transition areas where things that have been rejected for conditional use permits were things like electric split ductless units happen to be visible, or the roof line was too broad in size, mass, or you would know the exact words, and that was something that came out of the Planning Commission, and it was specifically in the case that I was watching was for an SRO, and of course, a lot of those come out of historic district standards. So are those then are those overridden, or how does that work relative to our historic districts?
Well, to use the example that you're bringing up, the applicant was proposing to build a building that was, I think, probably 30% larger than the maximum permitted building size in the zone.
Well, they weren't the only ones. I agree with you on that.
And
Sure.
so in that case, that's why a conditional use permit was required. Had it been an SRO application that met the size requirements, there would have been no design review, even in the historic district. The Historic Commission could provide recommendations for roof pitch, dormers, compatible siding. But ultimately, if an applicant building a single-family home, or in this case, an SRO, chose to present a design that was not historically compatible, were it not for the conditional use permit and the request to exceed permitted area, there would not have been a limitation on those design elements. We do have the split minis that you brought up, we do have a limitation in our code that applies universally to all housing types, is to not put mechanical equipment between the face of the building and the street. So they would be in a position to relocate those onto the backside of the building in order to meet that standard.
Maybe I'm still confused, Brandon. Thank you, and I appreciate it. I got most of it, but I'm still, to the example that we're talking about and others like it, is I understand that these are coded in outright, so forth, as a review, but then what I'm not understanding is when a conditional use permit comes into play for, let's say, an adjacent reason or a semi or non-related issue, like in this particular case, it was maximum floors, whatever it was. Then we also apply these things that would otherwise be not applied if not for the conditional use permit for something that was probably
Derek can probably
unrelated.
speak better to
Okay.
this than I, as the
Thanks.
planner that worked on that application.
Yeah, so in our 4 National Register listed historic districts, we have specific historic development standards that apply when a property is subject to site review or conditional use permit. The state law says that any residential project is supposed to be subject only to clear and objective standards, but that state law does specifically exempt historic standards from that because they recognize the value in where communities have gone to the effort of identifying historic districts, upholding a certain level of design.
And if I could just elaborate on that, one of the design standards that the city wrestled with is how large could buildings be dependent on their lot size within historic districts to be compatible with the districts as they built out. So where you have a lot size that's 5,000 square feet, the code in this case said that the building couldn't be larger than 1,918 square feet. But the applicant was proposing a building that was, I think, about 2,600 square feet. And so that's put them out of the outright permitted, clear and objective standards and asking for a conditional use permit, which is to say that even though I'm exceeding those maximum limitations, I've designed it in a way that minimizes that adverse impact and makes that argument. So that is a discretionary act on behalf of an applicant to go beyond what the code would allow outright under a clear and objective standard and ask for a special exception to those standards through the conditional use permit.
Understood. Thank you.
Counselor Sherrill?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you both. Again, just my sub-question is that sunset date of 2033 that has to do with design standards, does that cover historic too?
So again, we don't have for single-family homes design standards that apply to single-family homes, even in historic districts. You'll have a review process by which if you had a conditional use permit, they could be applied.
And that's
To
still a
show.
recommendation, not an outright codified.
So we do have some design standards in our code that apply to single-family residential. They're not held to them through site review, but it talks about having a gable, two of some
Right,
specific
right.
elements in terms of a gable roof, a porch,
And those would fall off
and
at
those,
that date.
those can't be applied until that sunset date
Okay,
comes,
got
unless
it.
the council shows otherwise.
Got it. My direct question had to do specifically like with the technical definition of a SRO, single room occupancy. You mentioned that they were only allowed in multifamily zones, and I'm not sure that I'm interpreting the enrolled bill correctly, but I believe that the benefit of the SRO is that they're allowed outright in any zone within an urban growth boundary, and if they're in a multifamily zone, they get to use the maximum density multiplier.
Yeah, we haven't yet gone through the ordinance to implement it, so.
Okay, but that
I would
one
say
is-
that we would have, currently, if you came in a single-family zone and wanted to do a 4-unit SRO, one kitchen, we would consider that one dwelling, and
Okay.
as such, approve it with just a building permit.
Yeah, so it is an outright allowable use in a single-family zone today, and that is enrolled currently, correct? I
It is
believe.
not codified in the sense that it defines SRO explicitly and lists it as a permitted use in that zone. So that is one of the changes that we'd have to come back to the planning commission and council to make it clear.
Okay, but until then, if an applicant was trying to exercise that state law, because it is in effect in the DLCD, if the DLCD had clear language, we could use a state standard and apply it until we get our rulemaking done and our code updated, correct?
As of January of 2027 is when that becomes effect under the state.
Okay,
that
I
is
I guess I'm still not clear. So this bill is signed into law, it's enacted,
And
it's
in that bill,
current.
it indicates that it goes into effect on January 1st of 2027.
I believe it says that it was enacted when it was signed by the governor because it was put into law for
I'll
the applicable
take a
standards.
look at it
Okay.
again. I
Has
thought that
anybody
there was
applied
a-
for an SRO since this has happened?
No.
No, so we haven't had to cross that bridge yet. Okay, all right, thank you.
Councillor Hanson?
Thank you. Councilor Sorrell asked a question the first round that I was hoping to get like a percentage kind of read. These are exciting changes. I believe they're exciting. But historically, we've been at like a 2% growth within the city. Does that sound right? Annually, year to year?
Less than one. in
Less
many
than
years.
one? So my thumb was on the scale there. What do we think these changes might do? I mean, how excited is the building community about these? Is this like meh? Or is this like, we might get, a floodgate opening up here? Is this going to be a game changer, like 5% growth? I mean, are we going to have to change any kind of like our growth strategy or anything of that nature? So twofold. What do you think the development community has told you so far about this? And then what do you think this might do to our growth numbers?
Yeah, I haven't had conversations with the Home Builders Association or other groups that would be able to articulate whether the expedited process will change their development plans. I would presume that market forces probably have a greater impact in terms of what development is in the pipeline than whether it takes 120 days or 60 or 90 days. But obviously, every month that you have holding cost is a cost for a developer. So it could essentially, by expediting the processes, it could ensure that you get more housing units on the ground faster. I just don't know if it's actually creating an incentive to create housing that would not otherwise be proposed. But that's my own personal opinion.
Well,
I don't
fair
know.
enough.
Derek, have you talked to anybody that?
I've had one developer indicate that they intend to submit some applications as soon as this takes effect, but they haven't done a pre-app, they haven't given any details.
Okay, it's still early days.
Yeah.
That's great feedback, though. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you both. I think that there's a lot of interest in seeing what this does in terms of our local housing development and seeing where that takes us and seeing what else we might need to do alongside of the state's changes. But so appreciate the detailed update and letting us know what's coming.
Thank you.
Okay, we move on now to our second agenda item, the Community Wildfire Resilience Bond. Sabrina?
Yes, so I think, Mayor, I can hand it over to you. But the mayor has brought this forward with some outside work with Viridian Ecosystems, as well as our Wildfire Division. So they have a presentation tonight. Mayor, I don't know if you wanted to introduce further?
Sure, thank you. So Woolsey McKernan, welcome Woolsey, is a local resident and has been following the work that we've been doing with our Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And his company, Viridian, is one of the companies that is really looking to see what are the innovative financing mechanisms that can help a community build its resilience, in this particular case related specifically to wildfire risk management and wildfire risk reduction. So Woolsey reached out to me. I met with him. I know Councillor Kaplan has also met with him. We've talked through some of these elements, and it seems like what they're thinking of is something that could potentially work for Ashland. And so what we're looking at this evening is to understand the model that they're discussing and also come to a decision as a council about, are we interested in continuing the conversation and deciding what this might look like in the future. So with that, I will hand it over. And Woolsey, welcome Chris as well. Would you like us to ask questions as we go?
Totally comfortable, if that's fine with me.
And just so everyone knows, and I know everyone has had the slides, some of the details happen a little bit later in the slide presentation. So it's also the case that if we ask a question that's covered later, please just let us know.
Great.
Okay, go ahead.
Sounds good. Good. So maybe just to get us started in dialogue with some of you and thinking about what makes the most sense to sort of orchestrate the dialogue here today, we thought it was best to start with Chris and the city and the work that's been done to date to make sure that we're all on the same page. And from there, I'll pick it up and then talk about how we can go ahead and put this in motion.
Thanks, Woolsey. Good evening. Pleasure to be here again. I'm here, as Woolsey said, to provide some context to this, and not necessarily to lend any particular support or not, but to say that the last time City Council had a touch point on this decision was to approve the CWPP last year. In August, the CWPP actually got signed and executed in October at the end of fire season through the last signature with the Oregon Department of Forestry. And as such, the CWPP has been kind of at work in our community, though the biggest barrier still remains funding. And one of the challenges that we foresaw in the CWPP was acquiring the amount of budget necessary to move at the pace that would be needed to significantly reduce the threat in our community to lives, infrastructure, economy, the whole package. And that still is a significant challenge, especially with the dwindling availability of grants at the federal level. In particular, the grant that we were kind of counting on, Community Wildfire Defense Grant, which is where we got the funding from the CWPP process in the first place, appears to be stalled out. We don't know if that funding is even going to be available in the future. There's supposed to be one more year of eligibility left under that program, but there's been no talk of it at all at the federal level. The state does have some dedicated wildfire funding. We've been able to secure about $200,000 of that from the Oregon Department of Forestry, but on the side of the Oregon Fire Marshal's office, we still don't have a grant program in place, though that's been promised and it's coming. But at the same time, we know that funds are going to be very competitive, and it's going to be hard to get an amount out of the state that would make a big impact on the overall budget and our ability to move forward at a quick pace. So I think Woolsey is going to cover most of the details on the funding. We've tried to provide as much of the factual basis for this on our program and our experiences in the past and what's been done to date and our work with AFR and with programs in the community to build that resilience so that he's able to present something to you today that makes the most sense as possible. So with that, I'm going to step away, and if you need something from me, feel free to call me back. I'm going to leave it to my very capable colleague.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. And thank you, Mayor and Council. and the public that's here in attendance for allowing me to make this presentation here today. Thank you, Chris. So I'm a member of this community, and as a member of this community, I well appreciate the risk upon which I feel every day. And in thinking about sort of the last 10 years of my career here and where I can make impact, wildfire resilience is certainly has been foremost in my mind. And in particular, the thought about the dearth of capital required across the West to solve the intractable problem of lack of availability of capital broadly in all 11 Western states. So for us, and for me in particular, given my background in municipal bond finance, I've been thinking about how forests are not treated as infrastructure, forests from a protection of a community standpoint, and how they should be treated as infrastructure. And if they're treated as infrastructure, they should be financed as infrastructure. And in that context, that's leveraging municipal bond finance to do so. So my colleagues, myself, of course, and my colleagues all living in the West, broadly, I've been engaged in a process of understanding what the city has done, the CWPP, the background, working with the various members of the community here, businesses that have been involved in all of the work to date, and trying to understand what has been done, as well as how we could orchestrate a bond to help support that. So in thinking about that, and I'll try and roll through these slides, and to the extent you want to interrupt, certainly okay. The status quo relative to what Chris just noted is a little under $1 million a year that's allocating towards a fund that enables work to be done, some salaries to be paid, but ultimately that delivers us resilience in decades. There are other options on the table. To the extent someone has the means, they can go either write a check to make their home resilient. They can perhaps pursue a HELOC, but not everybody can obviously do that. Commercial PACE, which is very much my background, available in 6 counties across the state of Oregon, not here in Jackson, would be another mechanism, but ultimately that's an individual ability to do so. Some of you may have been exposed to the Blue Forest Partnership in the Rogue Basin. That is another mechanism to fund the forestry work, but broadly that's in the forest. And as you just heard from Chris, broadly I would say public funds, federal, state, and otherwise, are not available as they used to be. So what we are proposing is a wildfire resilience bond, and I'll walk you through the details of that. First, at a very high level.
Hold on just a moment.
Yep.
Councilor Bloom?
Thank you, and thank you for everything so far. So, kind of a question popped in my head when you said what we're proposing. So I'm curious, how does Veridian fit into all of this? Are you just offering this to us for no cost?
Great question. And I probably should have stated that at the outset. I'm an interested member of the community, number one, right? Number two, I've got a background that I want to bring relative to the problem. And then 3, the company Veridian, and what I focus on is delivering this across the West. I'm acting as a developer, and ultimately developers are paid to the extent that something like this is pursued by a community.
Cool, great, thank you so much, appreciate it.
Yep, I should have stated that up front. All good. Yep. So by background, basically the idea here is everybody appreciates we have a payment mechanism in place here within our community. The idea is to basically take that payment mechanism, pull it forward to today so that we can get after the work that's required and outlined within the CWPP over a very short tenure of time, 3 to 5 years versus decades. Ultimately, that bond would be sold to investors. The proceeds would fund the treatment required, and we would be leveraging that water surcharge, and then the repayment would be paid back over up to 30 years. It's not a blank check. It's not a federal or state program. It's not currently an obligation to the city's general fund, depending on the structure it may be, and we should talk about that at the tail end. So just go ahead.
Councilor
Just
Gale?
real quick, thanks, Woolsey. Can you explain, what did you mean when you said generally it depends on how it's structured. So you're saying that it's what I would understand to be a revenue bond that comes through rates specifically, but that's not, it's not a GO that comes through the taxes, the general funds, but you kind of said it depends. So did I miss something there, or what does it depend on?
Yeah, I have a slide dedicated to that. so
Okay,
we'll
perfect.
talk
I'll
about
wait
that.
for it.
Yep,
Thanks.
coming up.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you. Just to kind of underline that, a quick question. You said that, I believe you said that we would leverage the water rate fund, so that is how this would be paid back?
Correct, currently, yep.
Okay, carry on. I'll have more questions later.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Look forward to them. So just background, setting the context from a understanding standpoint. Municipal bonds, of course, have had a very long history in building this country. And they're broadly defined as no generation being able to pay for something that's long dated. Golden Gate Bridge would be a fine example. Environmental action would certainly be another. And broadly, I guess, as I think about my own community here, thinking about Ashland, having access to a tool that would enable us to do something fairly significant and not being a city of 2 million, but a city of 21,000. So broadly focused on really us thinking about we, the people, solutioning this. I see now looking at the slide that we've got a little formatting issue there, but I think the most important thing in the context of Ashland is that our balance sheet is very strong. We have a very creditworthy counterparty in the city of Ashland. The headroom that is available against Measure 5 is significant. And broadly, we versus others in the state of Oregon are in a very good financial place relative to thinking about this as a solution for wildfire mitigation. The broader context is federally, the executive order from the Trump administration has been to focus on cutting down trees, cutting back on various initiatives at the Forest Service level. You heard from Chris that broadly grants are not available as they used to be. State level, we now have a ZIN tax and a rainy day fund that provides some funding, not enough for anything contemplated within our CWPP and broadly across the state. And I think fiscally, locally, we have a number of challenges that you all wrestle with every day. So broadly, the solution is in people's hands. So let me walk through exactly what this would look like from a financial standpoint and what we would be modeling. So first and foremost would be extending the work that has already been undertaken by AFR and carrying that across the line. I'll talk about the specifics here in a minute. Continuing the work in the wildland-urban interface on properties that either have been mildly addressed or yet to be addressed. And then most importantly, focusing on the home hardening, because that is one thing that we have not done here in the community with any great level of focus other than against the FEMA money that we received. And that's broadly focused on neighbor-led outreach and the idea with a bond paying for the program, the contractors, and ultimately the work that has to be undertaken. And code enforcement would be undertaken by the city itself. Stepping back to appreciate what other communities have done and are doing, I think if we look at first, the only city in the country that has orchestrated a bond for wildfire mitigation, that's Flagstaff, Arizona. They did a $10 million general obligation bond. The majority of the population voted for that. They did treatment. If you were to zoom in on Flagstaff, you would see it as a true donut. They've done work all the way around the city. Fire has swept through. Fire was stopped before it got to the city. And they've done a number of studies around the impact at the city level relative to that work. Rogue Valley has our forest resilience bond that's broadly out in the woods. Marin County is another example we would point to, Measure C, that delivers $20 million in annual revenue to Marin County. Again, majority approved. Not a bond yet. They are considering pivoting now to a bond. And then I've got a whole bunch of other communities that have measures similar to our own. So we're not alone here. High level for you all, and many of you here in the room know these inputs. But broadly, what we've done is put together a financial model, thinking about the inputs that we've orchestrated through the various partners here, and then the required activities against the CWPP. So structures, 12,000 of them, the water meters, which is the current approach, 52,000 acres, the treated acres of 13,700, 7,000 left to do, and then maintenance return intervals every 10 years, and really funding home hardening, the remaining vegetation work, defensible space, the public outreach, which we've started and have to continue doing, the admin and inspection, and then partnering with the insurance market to come along with us. Bond levers, and we'll have lots of debates about this hopefully, but ultimately the number of homes to harden, and whether we're using IBHS or California recently released a standard that perhaps might be more promising, what expense we would orchestrate against each home, the acres that we can afford to treat, what the public outreach and education looks like, who we're touching, and whether that's city staff, the nonprofits that we have here in our community, or for-profits, and then grant funding to buy those things down. So what we've done here is lay out 3 scenarios for you all to appreciate. The first being the base case. And the base case is our existing $7 a month water fee that we have in place and what that would look like to bond that. And we focused on just delivering against the home hardening, assuming that we all appreciate that that is the mechanism that we need to play catch up on more so than just the forest itself. And in that context, our $7 fee would allow us to do a bond of $10 million, which would assume no further grants, and that continues our $7 a month fee. Ultimately, without a bond, not doing that, that would take us 241 years to get to resilience if we're working against that. And obviously, that would not do the work of forestry outreach education and then the administrative overhead. The second case is the CWPP case. And if we just take the inputs relative to the CWPP, the target was to harden 90% of the homes in our community at $6,600 per structure. And then that was completing all the acres over 10 years. And that ultimately would add up to a $154 million bond, excluding grants. And that would ultimately be a $67 a month water fee or $800 a year per resident, or per resident that's paying the $7 fee currently. And ultimately, there would be nothing that would be out of scope. That would be a 100% solution. So that seems quite rich and probably out of reach. So what we are recommending, and this is where the debate would come, is something in between, where we would go after 50% of the homes from a hardening standpoint, lower the base cost to $3,000 per structure, get after the remaining 7,000 acres, include the 30 years of maintenance, because obviously you manage the veg, it grows back, and that would ultimately deliver us a $48 million bond, net of a $10 million grant, and that's assuming that we would pursue some level of grant support, which would deliver a $33 a month or $392 a year expense.
Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is around, this is obviously a revenue bond, right? And so what is the legal and financial risk we have if a future council decided to get rid of the fee, the wildfire fee entirely? Or would they not be allowed to get rid of the wildfire fee at that point?
Yeah, after you've actually sold a bond to investors, you would not be allowed to get rid of.
So we would effectively be tying the hands of the community to that fee on their utility bill for X number of
whatever
years.
period of time the bond was going to be in place. That's correct. Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And Woolsey, that's how all bonds
They
operate,
all
right?
work that way.
Because
That is-
whether it's a 10-year or 20 or 30, So the fact that it's connected to this particular fee is just the fee that it's attached to. It's not the decision isn't flexible because of this particular type of repayment. Just
Correct.
for our listening audience.
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. So as to structuring, the question, Councilor Dale, earlier is, I think just spend a minute here on this. Currently, obviously, this would be constructed as a revenue bond to the extent we were going to pursue a bonded mechanism against our existing $7 or whatever we might change it to. City council authorization, faster to market, prospectively maybe higher interest rates, and in my view, a bit regressive on low to moderate income residents, and I think there's a different model and mechanism we might pursue. And then there's, of course, a general obligation bond, which would include the full faith and credit and backing of the city itself, lowest interest rates, extremely marketable as a green bond, which is ultimately what this would be, and the first of its kind broadly in the country, and obviously would include voter approval and prospectively an increase in property taxes. And then a whole bunch of other options that are worth discussion. The first, as I noted, to many communities across California and the West are pursuing the same approach that we've taken, but using assessed value to try and make it a bit more of a measured expense relative to the communities and their ability to repay it. There's the opportunity to, of course, flex this $3,000 or whatever number we choose based on the ability to pay. We've had some dialogue about partnering with our local banking community to provide a credit facility that would allow borrowers to pursue doing more on their property to the extent they wanted to. There's an idea that's been talked about relative to the city supporting a loan loss reserve to help buy down the interest rate as we do with our energy efficiency program to date. And then there's the question of where the bill gets financed, whether it's through the utility bill, property tax, or otherwise, and then debt collection. And bringing this home, ultimately what we're focused on here from a delivery standpoint is really just delivering something that delivers safety to the community. Structural losses, if we look at peer-reviewed research, structural losses have been reduced by roughly half when we pursue defensible space and home hardening measures combined, and that's ultimately what we'd be orchestrating here. And then if we look back on spend relative to safety, also, great studies have been done behind the landscape level of work that would be orchestrated here. This is all about local jobs in the local community. And then ultimately, when we talk about the insurance industry and a partnership there, the idea is that by doing this work, we're ultimately focused on delivering insurability in our community. And there's a path to something else, but ultimately I think we're focused on insurability as sort of first and foremost. And then the last thing to say is there's a fair amount of research that's coming out that looks at cities' decision around resilience relative to their ability to bond and raise money and be a viable community generally in the capital markets, and that's another consideration. So we're, I think really what I'd ask of council is we've got a plan in place. We've got revenue authorization in position. I think we have the community will. We ultimately don't have the capital to go ahead and execute on that plan. This is an idea to pull that capital forward and go execute on a bond of some size, and that bears debate, but ultimately we're focused on protecting close to $3 billion in property value, over $90 million in annual revenue associated with the tourism, $500 million in payroll here, and ultimately this would be an initiative for Ashland, made in Ashland. So this is a lot of information. I'm looking forward to some questions and dialogue and perhaps engagement with my community members behind me. But ultimately, I would love to have you consider authorizing a working group to consider this more broadly and work through a number of next steps that are outlined here. Thank you.
Councillor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Will. Thank you very much for getting to that other slide. So just so that I can do some math when I get home tonight. So you had said that your preferred option is, or the one path would be the 48 million net of 10 million, which we're not sure we're going to get. But the math was based on getting the 10 to get it to 48. So then what is the term that we would be using? 30, I would assume?
30.
And then what are the reasonable interest rates that you would say, like if this were to happen tomorrow, what would you say in your experience could we expect, just so that I can run my own numbers for both a REV and a GO bond?
Sure, yeah. The feedback we've received to date is sub 4 in a GO bond context, and barely north of that from a revenue bond context.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hanson?
Thank you, Woolsey, and I appreciate your love for Ashland, bringing your professionalism here into this circle, and applying it to our problems here. Would you just hold our hands as homeowners here in Ashland? We have, let's just make a theoretical house that has vegetation right up against the house. They have a wooden fence. They have some kind of low-lying fruit. And they're looking at home hardening, and there's an opportunity on the table. Don't know what mechanism yet. But is this free money to a homeowner? Is this a lending strategy? Is this tight? Could you just kind of walk us through it, just the basics really quick?
Yeah. So I think first the context in responding to that, Eric, would be I, as an individual property owner, can go ahead and execute an incredible strategy from a home hardening standpoint. That doesn't mean anything unless I get my property owners to my right, left, front, and back. So it is we're all in this together context. And in that context, people without specific code enforcement are not going to go make those moves. So code enforcement would be one, and I would, urge Chris or others to comment on that. The context here is that we would be providing an allocation of capital to community members based on the science relative to the spread of embers and wind direction and the work that Oregon State has already done and continues to do in support of our community, and identify those neighborhoods that are most at risk of taking out the city, and basically put to those individual property owners an amount of money that, yes, would allow them to harden their homes. The scope has to be agreed and defined by both by science as well as what's reasonable relative to expenditure. And then the only thing I would add is the amount of money I believe should be in the context of what people can afford to pay ultimately. And the water meter fee is a very flat rate approach, and it's great. It provides capital to the community and the city, and I appreciate that. But if we did it on an assessed value basis, then it would be a bit more reasonable relative to how we're applying those dollars.
So follow-up? So thank you for that. I get that. And now to take it a step further, my neighbor and I are looking, or have been told that these are the prescriptions for our individual properties. And mine's $3,000, and they're both $3,000. But I have the means to pay that back. My neighbor does not. Would my neighbor essentially get that as a $3,000 grant from this? And then due to my financial situation, I would be paying it back through the water fee or through some other mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, currently it would broadly just be through the water fee if we're sticking with the water fee. So that's.
No, I'm sorry. What I meant to say is, would my neighbor get it as a grant essentially, but I would be paying additionally? Because our finances are different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if the difference being that if you switch to an assessed value, because you have a bigger house, you are of means, you'd be paying more into that bond than your neighbor would be.
But it wouldn't take any extra capital out of my
No,
pocket.
because you've already been paying monthly a larger amount of money than your neighbor might be.
And so to get the
that would
message
be the
out there,
leveling.
yeah, it would level it out so everybody would be allocated these resources. And then therefore, hopefully the adoption would be voluntary and robust.
Yeah, and I think you start with voluntary, but then there has to be a migration to a bit more of
Thou
'cause we've
shall,
already-
thou must do
Right.
it, right?
Right, because I guess we've had experience relative to the carrot, which was something, but we didn't probably get as much.
Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it.
Counselor Sherrill?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Woolsey. I've got a list of like 5 questions I'm going to bang through, but I feel that they're important. And I'm looking at all the questions through the lens of like, what value does the Ashlander get from this? And I really appreciate our staff. I know when the CWPP came out, it was like, hey, we're going to start with maybe 10 million a year. The city's going to lead the way. And now it's like another cost burden on the citizens' back. And I think it's a good cost burden, and I think it's probably worth it. But what value do we get? And I looked at some of the peer research that you were talking about, defensible space, of course, but what do we get when it comes to like a deliverable? My first question is, what's our deliverable? Like, how do we be assured that we have water to fight the fire, or that we have staff on the truck? The money, if it's defensible space and ember-resistant applications and removing flammable shrubs within a certain area of a house, like how do we tie the operation to an outcome for the citizen?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak to water availability, and I don't know if anybody else can speak to that, but.
The stuff on the big red truck that puts out fire? Nobody? I'm kidding. We'll see.
So I can't speak to that, but I think, if that's an expense of something that, there's an allocation of capital that has to be orchestrated in that particular direction for whatever the need is, then that's certainly, it's a CapEx item that would be considered here. I think number one, it's base level insurability. Now that I've been doing this and looking at doing something similar to what we're trying to orchestrate here in California in particular, base level insurability is a massive issue south of the border. My colleague here in Siskiyou County is, first lost his insurance and now is paying, 4 times more than he was through the FAIR plan. We as a state are fast behind. We in Ashland are fast behind. So I think base level insurability is the number one thing that we can deliver. The second context is the emerging examples and the movement of the insurance industry broadly to address and understand what these investments can deliver relative to risk reduction and how they should be, the industry broadly should be thinking about delivering insurance, number one, but also delivering some meaningful either reduction or some meaningful measure of support. And those examples are beginning to emerge, and I'm not up here to say that they, it's a quid pro quo of one versus the other, but ultimately, that's where we need to head as a society here in the West. And I think, that's probably like the number one thing from a resilience standpoint.
Thank you. That kind of hit on one of my other questions that I believe was really relevant to the private market, right? If we do right, in theory, there's Firewise programs, there's several programs that we've looked into as a city, but we have no guarantee that if we're using middle case example of $36 a month, that say it's X amount a year, that cost isn't going to guarantee us anything from an insurance standpoint because we can't dictate what they charge us, but we can see what we're currently paying. So do we have any data that shows our mid-case scenario of, say, it is a percentage of the assessed value compared to what insurance is costing now if somebody were to buy a home to move into this community?
We don't have that data, not in our community. Those points of evidence are starting to materialize in other communities, but we do not in this community today.
Okay.
But that would be part of the engagement here, would be to orchestrate that and be in partnership with a variety of insurers, both locally and at the state level. So the similar engagement that I'm having here, we're also doing at the state level. to pursue a similar effort and initiative that would orchestrate pulling in state-level actors from an insurance standpoint at the state level.
Awesome, that's awesome. And one more, just to be respectful of time.
Yep.
When we look at potential, the potential of working with other agencies and potentially looking at an impact study of what it would look like to maybe join forces with a local fire district and what that would look like as a bond measure, have we talked at all with any of our other organizations in the area through a study that's currently going on to look at what that would, what kind of partnership we could have, so we're not going out for a bond for one thing that looks like fire and safe and life safety, and then we're coming back and looking at something else when we potentially examine consolidations?
Yeah, we have, relative to the work that SOFRIC and the rest of the community has done across the Rogue Basin, and that would orchestrate towards a county-level bond, which is perhaps something that could be pursued. Obviously, there's a variety of political and otherwise views at the county level, and we would have ultimately less control in orchestrating a particular bond initiative at the county level. There's a consideration, as I just referenced, in thinking about the state and how we orchestrate a bond at the state level, and that's ongoing. But, you know, this, and sort of where the genesis of this has been off of an existing water fee that's in place and a CWP that's in place in this community, and trying to raise capital and bring that money forward so that we can get after the work broadly. But I think the whole concept of the Jackson County as a target, I've not fully unpacked that just yet.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Councilor Bloom.
Thank you. So the way I see it, I mean, we really kind of have two paths forward here. And one with this revenue bond option is it would be council authorized, and we'd essentially be, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, locking in a high fee for residents for the term of that bond. The other alternative is a GO bond, right? Going to the voters. Now, we were kind of having a side conversation about this earlier, but could you speak to what kind of effects, if any, this would have on the city's ability to go forward and raise property taxes up to the limit if there was some other need that the city had for that?
Yeah, I have not fully unpacked that. I've had some initial dialogue with Jordan and Sabrina around that. That's work that has to be undertaken to fully appreciate Measure 5 and 50 and the headroom, both with the existing debt that the city has as well as the loan that was recently undertaken relative to the water treatment plant. So that work has to be done, and then ultimately a better path to guidance for city council and the mayor's consideration ultimately.
Thank you.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah, I just want to speak to that just for a second, but then I have some other points that I wanted to make. My understanding is that a general obligation bond goes against our debt capacity, not against our Measure 5 and Measure 50. Measure 5 and Measure 50 is property tax assessment, so that would be our property tax or a local option levy, for example, but that the actual bond, any bond that goes against our general full faith and credit is against our debt capacity. And I think you said in there that we have very low debt in the city. My sense is we've got probably among the lowest levels of debt of any city in Oregon.
We do.
And that's a great thing. That's a great thing. But that's not the same as Measure 5 and Measure 50 limits on tax, $15 of taxes per thousand ceiling. Is that
That's
just to answer that?
Yep, and
Okay.
our headroom is at 266.
I know you were, because you had this conversation. But I want to make a confirmation of that, because that's not what you were going, where you're going, Wilsey. I want to just, Wilsey, thank you very much for this presentation. It was a lot here, and you went through it pretty quickly. But I'd like to see if I can boil it down to a couple of big concepts, because I think what's really under discussion here. First of all, going back to last August when Chris and Mark and presented the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which was a big thing and a big audacious thing. It took 2 years to put together. We asked a lot of questions, and we said, yes, we're totally committed to this because it's an existential threat to Ashland. We've got to do something about our wildfire risk. It's the highest priority of our community members to try to deal with that. We didn't do it before. We didn't do it after in response to the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, but because we approved the $7 wildfire risk fee, monthly fee on the utility bill before that, but it was with that in mind, knowing that we were going to put some money in place to help implement it. And I think you've done a pretty good job of showing how little that is in comparison to what actually needs to be done. Now, it wasn't supposed to do everything. That's money that comes into the city. We knew Chris and Marshall and Mark told us that some of these things were going to be paid for. Some of this cost, $100 million cost that Chris estimated, was going to be paid for by the city. Some of it's going to fall to the community members. So the $7 fee doesn't have to cover everything. But you made a really important point when you personalized it to your own personal situation, where you can do whatever you want in your house, but if your neighbors around you don't do it to make sure that they're putting screens of the right aperture so that embers don't get into your attic or your crawl space, that house is going to go up, the landscaping and all that sort of stuff. So we are all in this together. So every one of us need to do something here. And the bottom line is not everybody has the ability to do it. Some people do have the ability to use savings or borrowing to do some of these things on their house, and others don't. So we want to make sure that everybody can do.
So, Councillor,
Yeah.
Just for a moment, we are at 6:58. If we would like to continue this conversation, we need to contract for some additional time. Councillor Dale,
Move to extend for 15 minutes.
is there a second? All in favor? Okay, carry on, Councillor Kaplan.
Great. So we talked in approving the Community Wildfire Protection Plan about what is it that only the city can do. There are certain things that only the city can do, and we need to make sure that we're resourcing that. And there are other things that we know that others in the community can do, but it's really important that the city do certain things to make that possible. There are homeowners that need to do certain things, and the city can do some things to make that possible, or there are community groups that are doing things, and the city needs to do certain things to make that possible. So I'm looking at all of this as the constellation of money that's going to be there, making sure that we've got enough resources to be able to stand behind what the city needs to do to make sure that we can help our community members who don't have the resources to do some of that home hardening, that they're going to have the ability to do that as well, without overspending on people that really probably could, like you said, you could do it on your house. Ideally, we wouldn't give you $3,000 to do the work on your house. You would do it yourself, or maybe the city would facilitate some sort of loan for that. So it seems to me that all of this, what you've stood up is we've got a bunch of design questions that we need to, because you put a whole bunch of options here.
Yep.
And I'm trying to boil it down. So it seems to me, now this is where my question is. What are our questions that we need to really get to as a council? And I think there probably does need to be a working group on this if we want to chase it down. One thing is, you talked about a revenue bond, leveraging the wildfire risk fee. It's $7, or it could be higher, but whatever it is, that's one avenue. A second design question is whether it should be instead, that goes in equal parts on every single person that pays a water bill in this town, versus a general obligation bond, which is to taxpayers based on dollars per thousand valuation.
Yep, so
that's a progressive application of raising this money. Either way, it would fund a bond that would give us money up front to do the work that needs to be done, whatever that is. And we need to estimate how much that is and who gets access to it and all those things. So who gets access to it, how much it is another design question. Then, is this going to be equal grants to everybody that's in all homeowners in Ashland? You mentioned $3,000. Is that the right thing? So there's another design question, which is how much of it is grant, how much of it is loan, all those kinds of things. And what do we need to do in order to get sufficient coverage? So where are we going to prioritize it? And this is just the portion that's within the city limits. On the urban areas around residences, around commercial buildings, it's not even talking about the continuing the work that we've done for many years up in the watershed. So that's the other design issue, which is how much of this is down here in the city, how much of it is in the watershed. Have I missed some of the design issues that we need to tease out?
There are others, but that's the
Those are
core.
the core.
That's the core of it right there.
Because I'm sensing that if we can get to that core and try to really tease it out, then we can have a lot more, practical conversations about, what else we can accomplish. Is that okay?
Excellent. Thank you. Bob.
Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And this is a wealth of information. So my thought around this is just kind of dialing it back a little bit, is this is wildfire mitigation. Well, I wish we could mitigate it, but the risk is important to all of us. So looking at this hardening, something that I know from my experience living here, there's so many HOAs in Ashland that have taken it upon themselves to actually make sure that their neighborhood is resistant. I'm grateful to live in one. We put fireproof fences, gates around and fences, and I see that happening more and more in so many neighborhoods, not just HOAs. So I applaud everybody that has the means to do that. And then there's others that don't have the means to do that. So something that my colleague, Councilor Kaplan, mentioned is shaking this out. My concern is we added a $7 surcharge to that water fee for this purpose. And at that time, we added additional fees to our utilities. Some people, a lot of people, are in a bad way. So when I look at this coming in front of people at a $33 rate per month, that means $40 per month just looking at this. $40, that's gas, that's food. And I appreciate what was brought up earlier. However, I believe that Flagstaff in Marin County, it went to the voters. Is that correct?
In both cases.
Yes. And so looking at Ashland, are you proposing that it goes to the voters?
That is not my decision. There's two paths that have to be debated.
And I believe they definitely have to be debated, because I just want to say that the way I look at it right now, implementing this now is not the time. And it's like, when is the time? I don't know, wildfire could happen any given day. And so I'm not, God, I can't say hey or nay on that. However, what I do know is that an additional fee, I don't see it happening right now. And something that was asked earlier about what can we do as a body, I'm not in favor of any type of code enforcement on any individual to have to do this. So a work group and get more information, but I'm sure that I'm just looking at the faces. It seems like you have a lot of support here, but I would like to look at other opportunities or send it to our community and let them vote on it. Thank you.
Councillor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. So I know that all of us in this room, or most of us, could spend hours. So my question to you would be, for someone, my neighbor, that I'm going to speak to this about, that has very limited attention span, is going about their way. So what would you say in 30, 60 seconds max, where I'm having a brief conversation of, relative to this program, and Councilor Sherrill talked about value, tell me what success looks like and how is it going to be measured, to someone that only has 30 seconds to get that explanation?
Yeah, I think success is that we have insurance, period. And to the extent you have a mortgage, you probably do, I do, you're going to continue to own your house and not lose it to the lender because you can't get insurance. That's what success looks like at its highest level, right? Yep.
So we're coming to the end of our time here. I wanted to just add in a couple of thoughts. First, thank you, Woolsey, for both this and for the conversations that we've had leading up to this conversation. One of the things that we have seen in the last 10 years is wildfire go from being something that sometimes used to come in and grab a couple of houses at the outskirts of town to being something that has the potential to cause catastrophic damage to this community that we might very well not be able to recover from. So when I think about what does the wildfire situation look like for us, to me it's safety. When people ask me what keeps me up at night, a fleeing event in this town with us built up the side of the mountain and having the demographics that we have is the part that keeps me up at night. What we know is that wildfire risk is increasing year over year. It is moving very quickly. It is outpacing communities across the West. And the risk that we have, I mean, when we look at these numbers, when we think about things like $50 million, when we're looking in those kind of ranges, it's a lot of money. It is serious, to my colleague's point, to ask this community to make that kind of investment. And it is also an enormous amount of money and people that are at risk if we don't figure something out that allows us to go forward quickly to get to a place of maintenance, rather than taking the risk of trying to do the incremental piece year over year, decade over decade. I think there are a couple of things that are really important that I've seen from this council as we've gone through conversations about utility billing and about how this is impacting, different kinds of things are impacting our residents. And that comes back to Councilor Hanson, your point around, how do we build a system that is equitable, right? That actually works for the people in this community, for the people who can afford to pay it, for the people who can't afford to pay it. And how do we move together as a community into a place of greater resilience and greater safety and greater protection, which is right at the top of the list for me. What the question in front of the council this evening is, would we like to continue down this path with Woolsey and his team of identifying what those different pathways could be? So of course, we're in a study session now. We all know we're not making a decision here. But what I am envisioning is that we would continue to work with them and we would come back to the council with some options that have been clarified. So is the council interested in these different kind of pathways? And whittle it down, and then if the council is still interested, then we continue to develop whatever the pathway is that the council believes is the best interest of the community. So with that, what I would recommend what I'd ask the council to do is to essentially authorize me and another one or two councilors to continue to work on this with Woolsey as an expression of interest in this potential program. And what I'd like to do is just go around the horn and find out each person's thoughts on moving forward in that way. Whoever would like to start. Councilor Sherrill?
Yes.
Okay. Councilor Dale?
Yes.
Yes, but I don't think that we should pursue even having a conversation about the revenue bond. That's just my piece of it.
So in this, if we move forward, then we would come back with a variety of different options for the council to consider.
And may I actually have a qualifying just question to staff and Sabrina is you good with staff involvement as part of this and have the resources to be able to allocate to this?
Yeah, I think what will be key for us is what financial mechanism you want us to model, or if we're modeling both. So we'll need to kind of figure out where this fits in the work plan.
Back to you, Councilor Bloom.
So yeah, I think that raises the question is I think we can go around and say, yes, we want to have a working group and pursue this, but I think we should also make a decision. Do we want to explore both or do we want to explore one? Because it costs staff different amounts of time, different amounts of effort, and why spin our wheels if we kind of all agree that maybe there's a better singular path?
So let me clarify the request in front of the council. The request is for the working group to assess multiple pathways that include the revenue bond and come back to the council with those pathways for further refinement and decision about whether that's a way forward. Councilor Sherrill?
Yes.
Councilor Dale?
Yes.
Councilor Bloom?
Okay.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yes.
Councilor Duquesne?
No, I don't want to pursue the bond.
Okay. Councilor Hanson?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so we have our guidance from council. I will plan to be part of this conversation and then also looking for 2 other people. So if you are interested in being on this working group, please reach out to me and let me know. And then if we have more than 2 other people interested, then we'll have some conversations and see who should serve on it with me. Great. Well, that takes us to the end of our agenda this evening. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you again, Woolsey, and all of the folks who've come out to hear the conversation. Meeting is adjourned.